Jason Singler, the SanteeSwapper. Back in February, I saw an amazing display at the Indianapolis Trade-O-Ree. There was this fine gentleman off to the corner, but I wasn't brave enough to go up and speak to him. But I took pictures of all of his panels. And then here I am in October now at the Summit Trade-O-Ree in West Virginia. Neal Bronder is here, and he's brought his fantastic display of Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, 3F and 3, help me out, B, right. And so I wanted to get him on tape, mostly because this is exactly what I always talk about in the Hot Finds, that we need to share the history of scouting. And he's even written a book that we'll talk a little bit about the Western Pennsylvania camps. And so, Neal, thank you very much. Can you kind of start maybe by just telling us, because you told me last night, how did you even get started thinking about trying to do such a massive collection?
I had a very close friend of mine had passed away, and I went to his funeral service in Washington, D.C., and when I drove back home, I thought of all the things that we used to do together, and one of them was collect patches back in the 60s and 70s. And so on the way home, I thought, well, I'll put a patch collection together in memory of my friend Bob Smolin. So that's how it started. I started 10 years ago, and I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, so I concentrated the collection on Western PA. And that's what I have. And I was really more interested in the history of all the things. So when I did a lodge, I did a history of the lodge and also a short history of the council and the camps that they had, starting from the very beginning when they were just, some of them were second-class councils, some of them were just councils for one county or one town, and they merged and grew and so forth from there. So it was a really great trip. And when I was doing that, I was amazed at how many camps popped up in my research that I never heard of before. So I started digging down into that, and out of that, I decided to do a book, and I discovered over 60 official council camps in Western Pennsylvania that no longer exist. But at one day, they were the camp for the council. So I did a book on that, and I was amazed at how much information was out there about those camps. And this was a real journey. This took about 7 years of research, researching these camps. I actually visited 90% of the sites. It was like being a detective, really, going to these different areas and finding these things. And a lot of the research I did was from old newspaper articles. And I really developed a technique to mine those things and come up with keywords and key searches, which found other words and stuff. And I have thousands of pages of newspaper articles. And what I did in writing the book, I would actually make physical copies of the newspaper article. And I'd sit down and I'd arrange them in chronological order. And then I would start writing the story of the camp from that and go through that. And it's, like I say, I'm a history buff at heart, and it was really a lot of fun doing that. So,
yeah. Well, let's, why don't you grab the book and we'll make sure it's in the camera. So let's talk a little bit about this, because one hope I have from this interview is that other people can be inspired. So maybe give us a little bit of your tips. Now, this is newspapers.com. Mm-hmm. Okay. And so this is an archival website where you can do keyword searching and it'll find stuff. I've used it before, but I will say I'm 52 now. I am so old that I have actually gone to the county library when I lived in Lumberton, North Carolina, and gone through the microfilm, searching for stuff. Did you do that as well, or tell us about that journey?
Some of the newspapers aren't online, and you do have to go to the microfilm. My home camp, Camp Ucoco in particular, the Butler Eagles in the library on microfilm, and you search through that, I can only do about 4 hours at a time. I get motion sickness after that, going through all of it. And it's really, really hard, because you could search for the 4 hours and not find anything. So that's the most difficult. And I've gone to the Erie Library, done work there, the McKeesport Library, the Homestead Library, the Butler Library to do that. And that's the hardest part. The other thing I got into on a few of the camps was going to the county records department, looking up the deeds and researching the deeds and property for camps like that, and where were they bought originally, who was the original owner of the property, the transfers, the different on the additions to camps. When I did Camp Ukoko, I recorded all the, they don't have maps in these offices, but they have legal descriptions. And that's what the surveyor uses to do a survey. So I copied all the surveys. I took that to a friend of mine who's a professional surveyor, and he plotted that on his CAD program. And then we downloaded topographic maps, coordinated the scale between his CAD plot, and overlaid it on the topo map to record the different purchases of the camp. So people for the first time could see when the different pieces were added to the camp and what the boundaries were. And so that was pretty interesting for me.
Yeah, exactly.
So, but yeah, a lot of research. Plus, I would search for any lodge records. There's a lot of printed histories, printed handbooks and stuff like that. And I would gather all those that I could, plus historic photographs. Found a lot on eBay. I had access to some of the council offices that are old records, and I could copy photos out of there. It was really great. A lot of the, with all the mergers of councils, some of the councils acquire the records of the other council that they absorbed. And you'd be amazed how much information is in those old files, especially when they did appraisals to sell their camps. They had photographs of all the buildings and stuff. And so there's information, if you can find it, if you can dig down and get to it, it's like, oh, you really discovered a treasure here, you know? Yeah. So.
Well, in a minute, we will kind of get Neal to narrate some of his displays, and you will get to see those on video. But I did want to touch on this. You know, a lot of people who do what we do, or, you know, scouting memorabilia collectors, really focus on the patches. And I think the thing that stands out about Neal's presentation, as you'll see in his frames, is again, that history. So every one of the frames has a historical write-up. And then as he shared, he's got the book, he's got a lot more information. You know, he couldn't stick everything on there. But a lot of people, for example, will do frames and they'll just have the AOA patches because that's kind of their thing. But what I noticed about your frames is you have a council patch, you have camp patches, and the OA, which really all of it ties together. I mean, there is no order of the arrow unless there's a camp to do your ordeals and your ceremonies. None of that exists without a council, so it all matches together. And so I love how you laid out your displays, and I'll get you to tell us more about those. You mentioned some of the other things besides newspapers.com. You know, how do you think someone, because here's the thing I know in my area, South Carolina, North Carolina, not a lot of people have done this for their camps. There's a few historical societies like Camp Raven Knob, Old Hickory has a historical society, and some others. But then I know in South Carolina, there's almost none. Like this whole idea doesn't exist, you know, in South Carolina of having a book or anything that really details all this history. So what are some other suggestions you could have for how people could get started with this for their own home council? They weren't trying to be as ambitious as you and do the whole half of the state.
When I did Camp Ukoko, I was so fortunate that the ranger at the camp went to the council office and digitized all the executive board meeting minutes starting in 1923. So I had a blow-by-blow account of what the executive board was doing every month, every year. And so I used that as the basis of the book for Camp Ukoko. And it was so much information, it was hard to get my arms around it. There was thousands of pages. And so I read everything, and I usually take notes, and I found out it was just too much. So I took a break, and I went back, and I decided I'm going to write it year by year. So I took 1923, got all the documents for that one year, and wrote that year. And then went to the next year and the next year and went through it that way. It was the only way I could manage all the information. It was like really overload, you know. Yeah. So I was fortunate for that. I had some really neat discoveries. I bought on eBay some glass slides, photographs They were 4-inch by 4-inch. The guy told me they were from Camp Ucoco, and I asked, how do you know? Because I always document all my research. And he says, well, that's just what I always heard. So in going through the executive board minutes, I found a brochure promoting the camp in 1925 that had photographs that came from the glass slides that I purchased. Yes. So I confirmed that those photographs were the first year of camp, 1923, by doing that research, And then all of the stuff in my book, if you go to the back, I document all the sources. A lot of histories are done by hearsay and oral tradition. All mine have documented sources for it. I got into that because originally I did genealogy work, and you always have to document your sources. So I make a real point of that. And it's funny sometimes because I'll be at a Trade-O-Ree or something, and someone will come up and say, well, I read in your book this, and that's not true. And I said, well, here's the documents, because it doesn't go with his oral tradition. Yeah. So you find that. So that's kind of, it's really detective work as far as I'm concerned. So.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to make this about my area of the world, but I will just tell you that somebody similar in my, where I grew up in PD area, there was always this rumor that the camp was owned by a trust. That was the original founding, and that the council didn't actually own the camp. That was kind of like the legend, But this guy actually went back and found the documents, and so that led to eventually the board of the council recreated the trust. The committee members of the trust had to go to the South Carolina Attorney General's office and get them to approve it. Anywho, and they were able to get all that together. And now the camp actually is controlled by a trust. It's not controlled by the council, which was wonderful when bankruptcy happened. And, the council didn't own the camp. This trust did. So anywho, I don't get up on a sidetrack, but I do think there's value in that. Let me ask one more question before we kind of look at your boards and how you did this. You have spent, you can tell us how many hours getting all this together, but the question, since you've had this together, what kind of a reaction have you had from people? And what do you kind of see as the bigger purpose of this display that you have spent so much energy and time putting together?
My main goal is, I hear so many times people say, I have this in my collection. And I said, well, what is that? And it's a 3-ring binder somewhere down in the basement. No one ever sees it. The reason for doing displays, I hope to motivate other people to put their collections on display so other people can enjoy them and see them. One of the really cool things about this display is when you have flaps, all the different variations, F1, S1, S2, they're all in the collection. So you can actually compare the flap that you have in your hand against the board and see which one it fits into. It really helps, I think, young collectors see the variations, what they're talking about, and how minute those variations are. I mean, some of them are really down in the weeds, So, but I think that points that out, and I think it helps young collectors. And like I said, I'm trying to motivate people to put their stuff on display and share it.
Well, thanks, Neal. We're going to switch up a little bit here now and try to get a recording of the display and let people actually see what you've done. All right, so I want to hand the microphone to Neal and let him kind of explain how he did this. And again, I love this idea that he's planting a seed that other people can follow, and you've done this so uniquely. Also, you got to tell us your cheat of how you got the patches mounted, because that's always a question. So.
Well, this is my home lodge, Uniloctico Lodge, and they merged with Pankanky Lodge to form Cuscatani Lodge. And a lot of people look at this display and they say, well, you don't have very much in Cuscatani Lodge. And the reason for that is my collection is limited, okay? It goes from the beginning up to the end of 1973, and that's when it stops. And this is when Cuscatani was formed in 1973, and these were the patches up to that point. If you go up past 74, there's probably 80 flaps or so in this to be in that frame, but I don't have that. So what I do is I have the flap issues here, and I pretty much have all the issues. Even when there's a fake or like that, it's included there for people to look at. I have the chenille patches, And then I have the neckerchief patches here, and then a flavoring of camp patches. And you look here, this is what's interesting is Camp Agawam originally was Camp Phillips in the original day. Then it changed to Lawrence County Camp and then Camp Agawam. But so you get a little bit of history in there. Then I use this to identify almost all of these frames have a red and white council strip, which kind of dates it. That ended about 1973 or so. And then each of the frames has a short history of the lodge. I tried to put the first chief's name in there, what area meets they hosted, and then there's a short history of the council starting from its very beginning, whether it was like this one was Butler County Council and when it formed and the prior camps that they had. So you kind of get a little bit of interesting history. And then there's a legend that identifies the flap numbers here. There's the F1 first flap, F2 down through there. So you can kind of identify it that way. So to really understand the collection, you got to go to the map here. The collection's based on old Area 3F and Area 3B, and it runs up to the end of 1973. And on this, I listed all the area chiefs for 3F and 3B. My name is here as the last area chief, 1973 of Area 3F. And then these are all the area meet patches for all those meetings starting back in 1948 when Camp Twinneco. What's kind of interesting about the areas is when Brunton was the national chief, he started the area meets system in 1938. And it kind of began in Western Pennsylvania and was spread around the country after that. That was one of his programs as national chief. So, a lot of information and a lot of early stuff started back here in Western Pennsylvania. But this helps you understand. So this shows all the lodges, and then there's a frame for each of those lodges, and then each of the merged lodges after that. So there's 24 frames in all, and it covers all Western Pennsylvania.
So I think for anybody who's listening, the thing that I also love about Neal's collection is that it has a definite beginning point and kind of an end point. And I think that in the idea of displaying things, that's really helpful because sometimes if you're adding new issues to your display, it's like it's never going to be done. And you were able to have just sort of like something that makes perfect sense. You finished as area chief, and that is sort of the stopping point to put the cork in the bottle for your collection, and then you're able to go back. I do want you to tell us about the again, going back to the CAD drawings, the surveyor. You told me last night about this, and I think this is such an impressive thing. Tell us how you got that.
I had an architect friend who owed me a favor. So I went to him, and he did this on his CAD system. And he printed all the counties in here. And then I sat down with him and told him which lines to eliminate to come up with the council lines, So he was able to do that. And then I was able to plot that out on our plotter. And then I took that to the print shop and had it mounted on foam board to come up with the display. So it really shows a lot of these small councils in here in these lodges. Not many people knew the boundaries of them. And I was able to go back in newspapers and see the communities that were in those and kind of plug them together to come up with these shapes here to find that. So, but that's I was in the construction business, so knowing architects and engineers and surveyors to help do this stuff has really paid off. So.
That's great. That's great. All right, so what I'll do is I'll make sure that I take individual pictures of all the other frames because we would be here a long time if we had to explain them all. But again, what you'll see in the frames is Neal has a mixture, again, of the Order of the Arrow, the camps, and the council, and then he has the history write-ups, which I think is absolutely wonderful. So that's a real thing. Hopefully, if you don't take away a few things from this recording, is that the thing that a lot of patch collectors are guilty of is we display our patches and we don't have any of the history. And the problem for a younger person who's looking at your display is they can't read the board and understand any of the history. It doesn't, they don't know the difference between the S1 and the S2 and the C1 and the C4, whatever number system we use, but they can read the history. And so Russell Smart, I have a little interview with him that I did where he talked about there's 3 things you got to have. And one of them is you have to grab people's attention, because most people are not going to stand at your board and read every word and look at every patch, but you have to be able to grab their attention. And then the next layer is sort of pulling them in with something interesting that they would want to pay attention to. So anyways, Neal, this has been great. Thank you so much.